Hello, I'm Sarah Barth, Executive Director of Semper Virens Fund. Thank you for joining us for another in our Under the Redwoods webinar series, in which we explore the beauty, history, science, inspiration of redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Semper Virens Fund acknowledges that the redwood forests of the Santa Cruz Mountains are among the ancestral lands of many indigenous people who cared for the lands for millennia until they were forcibly removed. And we are grateful to work today with some of their descendants, in particular the Amamutsan tribal band and the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, to support them in restoring their cultural and traditional relationships to these magnificent lands. I also want to start by thanking Scharf Investments for underwriting this year's webinar series, the Under the Redwoods series. We're grateful for them, to them for their support. Many of you have been on these webinars before, but just to remind you, you can ask questions via the Q&A function below on your screen or the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible at the end of the event. And sometimes we don't get to enough of them, we'll follow up via email following. And if you have to duck off, or if you missed it or a friend missed it, we will be rebroadcasting this series on our website. So look for it there. Before we get going with our speaker, who I can see here on the screen, just a couple things to update you about with regard to what's going on at Semper Virens Fund. We just hit a major milestone. We just closed out a multi-year capital campaign, fundraising campaign, and raised $15.5 million for our Redwoods Now for All Forever campaign. Just a reminder of what generous and committed supporters we have, including those of you who are on this webinar. We are incredibly grateful, and more important than whether we're grateful, the landscape is grateful. Those funds will be used to support the purchase of the easement at Camp YMCA, at the YMCA's Camp Jones Gulch property, to ensure permanent protection for 39 acres of old growth redwoods. These are the largest remaining unprotected stand of old growth redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So it's a real conservation prize, and we're excited to complete that deal. And also those funds will be used to help steward over 11,000 acres of property, forest property that Semper Virens owns and is responsible for caring for, to help really restore those forests and ensure they're resilient in the face of climate change. So thank you to all of you who are a part of that campaign. This has been a pretty big year for us and for conservation in general in our region. And one of the reasons is what we're going to talk about today, and that is public access and trail building, and opening up these remarkable forests and other surrounding ecosystems for the public to be able to experience and enjoy. December 3rd marks a huge moment in our organization's history, because it is when we will be opening to the public San Vicente Redwoods, which is the large park-sized property that we co-own with our partners, Peninsula Open Space Trust. And it's taken 11 years of partnership to care for that property. You've heard us talk about some of our restoration efforts there, including recent efforts to remove the Mill Creek Dam. And now we're moving into the next phase, in which trail building is occurring. And on December 3rd, the property will finally be ready for the public to get a glimpse of that property. And that is only possible with the support of our partners. You've heard our partners mentioned many times, but Peninsula Open Space Trust, Save the Redwoods League, and of course, Land Trust of Santa Cruz County. And their part in the partnership was to design this public access program. And our speaker here today is going to tell us about implementation of that design, because he is the literal trail builder. Before we get into that, and before I introduce him, I would say it's also timely that we're talking about trails and public access, in part because we are on the brink, or we thought we were on the brink, of seeing trails open at the Chitoni Coast Dairies National Monument, which of course is adjacent to San Vicente Redwoods. Semper Virens was really involved in spearheading the effort to get that property designated as a national monument, and it's been a long and strange trip since then to try to get a plan in place that would allow for public recreation. We just got news that that plan is actually going to be delayed for a bit, but I remain confident that we will see it eventually open to the public. It may just take a little longer than we had hoped. And our speaker here today is intimately involved in that effort as well. So with that, let me introduce him. Matt DeYoung is the executive director of our region's preeminent trail building organization, the Santa Cruz Mountains Trail Stewardship. And their whole reason for existence is to help create and build and advocate for trails that the public can use to access the remarkable natural wonders of our region. And he has a long history working with this organization and with multiple agencies on multiple lands in our region, designing and building trails. And he and his colleagues and the volunteers at his organization are in the midst of doing that right now on our property, San Vicente Redwoods, on the adjacent property, BLM's Chitoni Coast Areas National Monument. And although we aren't quite there at opening yet, he's got his hands literally dirty implementing those trails and building those trails for us to eventually enjoy. So with that, Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you and say welcome to the Under the Redwoods series.
Thanks, Sarah. It's really great to be here. I'm really excited to talk about trails today. Let me pull up my presentation and we'll dive right in. All right, here we go. Yeah, so once again, I'm Matt DeYoung. I'm the executive director of the Santa Cruz Mountains Trail Stewardship. Today, we're going to talk about the organization, what we are, what we do, who we are, our role at San Vicente Redwoods and at Chitoni Coast Areas, and as well as about trail design and trail construction. We're going to be pretty high level on the trail design and trail construction parts. We do a training program for our volunteers, staff, and agency partners. We would usually cover these topics, over 4 classes, 3 hours each in the field and in the classroom. So we're going to be high level today, but we can dig into specifics and any details people are curious about in the discussion. So we're your local nonprofit trail stewardship organization. And what that means is that we partner with local land managers to fund, design, build, and maintain sustainable trails, as well as pump tracks. So trail maintenance is a huge part of what we do. We're working with all of our local land managers in Santa Cruz County and some beyond to address ongoing maintenance of trails. This is an example here. This is the Yukon Trail in the city of Santa Cruz Pogonip Open Space Preserve during one of our wet winters, which is hard to imagine these days. But the trail had some issues with drainage, and then there's some issues with erosion. So we worked with our staff, our volunteers in the city of Santa Cruz to develop a plan where we designed these drainage structures called drainage lenses, and then worked with our volunteers to put these in the ground. So here you see some volunteers placing rock. We wheelbarrowed over 30 tons of rock a half mile into the site here to repair the trail. And at the end of the day, like that muddy mud hole looked like this, and it still looks like this today. So this is an example of the type of work we're doing all over the region to keep our trails, safe, enjoyable, as well as minimizing impacts to the environment. Trail construction is another big part of what we do. Run through some of our projects to give you guys some context. Hopefully some of you have enjoyed some of these trails. The Enchanted Loop reroute was our first major partnership with California State Parks. The original route went up a very steep hillside that was subject to some pretty extreme erosion. So the trail was moving every year so people would get out of the rut. So we had this huge swath of the hillside that had been impacted by the trail. And we were seeing sinkholes opening up in the trail. So some real safety issues. The trail is draining into Baldwin Creek, which does have salmonid habitat species there. So some real issues there. And we decommissioned that trail, restored it to coastal prairie habitat, and then built this beautiful sustainable trail to replace it. Emma McCurry Trail in Pogonip Open Space Preserve was actually our first trail project, opened in 2013. It connects downtown Santa Cruz with UCSC, Henry Cowell State Park, as well as Wilder Ranch. It gets over 100,000 trips a year, so a very popular route and a key connection. The Flow Trail in the Soquel Demonstration State Forest, more mountain bike oriented trails, 4 miles of berms and jumps and rollers. It's been very popular up there. We rerouted the Pogonip Creek Nature Loop in the Pogonip Open Space Preserve. This is an interpretive trail that was intended to be accessible to all users, and it had some really steep sections that made that a challenge. And it also had some natural resource issues around that, erosion. So we decommissioned that and rebuilt this as part of a training program for our volunteers. Glenwood Open Space Preserve in Scotts Valley, about 8 miles of trail on that couple 100-acre preserve there, right in the neighborhoods. It's a great resource for that community. Another trail at Wilder Ranch, the West Inglesman reroute. The original West Inglesman route was on an old farm road that was never intended to have public access or year-round use. It was, built for a dairy farmer to go check on the cows every so often. So we saw some real issues with that, with erosion, with really deep ruts forming, again draining into a salmon-bearing creek. State Parks is having to grade it every year, so huge maintenance headache. So we decommissioned that road, returned it to coastal prairie habitat, and then built a sustainable multi-use trail to replace it, which is more enjoyable, better for the environment, and less maintenance. Saratoga to Skyline Trail connects downtown Saratoga with Sanborn County Park. Beautiful trail, some really interesting bridges out there. Definitely worth the trip. Saw Pit Trail in the Soquel Demonstration State Forest. So the Soquel Demonstration State Forest is run by CAL FIRE, and it's actively logged. They demonstrate best practices for logging and do research up there. And the original Saw Pit route was an old logging road, which had grown in over the years and turned into a trail. But they did a timber harvest there and reestablished the road. So the trail went away. So we rerouted that trail outside of the area where they have logging infrastructure so that it won't be impacted by future timber harvests. Pump tracks are like a skate park for bikes. And we've built several of these now, some out of dirt, but many out of asphalt. This one is in Watsonville and opened just last year. It's been a huge hit. There's not a ton of bike infrastructure down there, so and lots of enjoyment on that. Done the same thing in Santa Cruz at the west side, pump track. The same Vicente Redwoods. Sarah alluded to the impending opening, which we are very excited about. We first got involved with this project in 2015 to do the trail design. So the trail design's been complete for quite a while, and that went into the public access plan. And now we're working on the first phase of that, which is going to open December 3rd. So the first 9 miles of trail there are under construction now. We're charging ahead to get that all complete for opening. Just today, they finished pouring the last concrete abutment for the bridges. So lots of excitement there. And, a really unique trail network in that we really started with a blank slate up here at San Vicente. It was, there's an existing road infrastructure there, but it was decided that, hey, we want to have really nice trails. We're not going to reuse the roads, which have some of the issues we heard about with those other projects earlier. So we're really able to design the trails to meet, the management goals on the property, like, staying away from mountain lion habitat, sensitive species, but also to provide a great user experience. We're able to build trails for specific experiences. So we've got the trails up there split between hike and horse trails and bike and hike trails. So people can self-select for the experience they want to have, and the trails are built differently to support those different types of uses. So that's going to reduce user conflict. It's going to create more resilient trails. It's going to be a more enjoyable experience. We're really looking forward to getting people out there to enjoy those trails. So how do we do all this? A little back on the organization. We have a staff of 20, over 600 volunteers every year, do over 10,000 hours of work, 1,500 members, and a diverse funding stream. So we are a licensed contractor. Most of those projects I mentioned earlier, we self-funded, but San Vicente, for instance, and the Saratoga Trail, we were hired to build those trails, and any profit we make on those projects goes back into our self-funded projects. So most of those other ones. The volunteerism is a huge part of what we do. It's key. We couldn't do what we do without our volunteers. It's really, I credit our success to being able to, do this very well. It's something that a lot of agencies struggle with. It's very time consuming and takes a lot of staff to put on good volunteer events. So we've kind of come up with a secret sauce there where, we have our dig days at premier volunteer events with up to 100 people. And these events will get announced in a newsletter on a Monday morning, and they're full within an hour. So we're selling out our free volunteer events, which we're just, humbled by the amount of interest in stewardship So I see a lot of people coming back repeatedly. It's a very social environment. And really, people are doing meaningful work. We've really invested in training our volunteers so that they're able to do some pretty technical stuff and just get a lot done. So we've done that through our Trail Academy program, which I alluded to at the start of the presentation, where we train our volunteers on maintenance, trail maintenance, design, construction, and most importantly on leadership. So the hardest part of any job is always the people. So we've got this whole track through this academy where someone can become a crew leader and then help us lead those smaller groups during those big events. So really effective use of all that labor out there. Had about 200 people go through that training program and become crew leaders. So they've got this great legion of engaged volunteers that help us get a ton of work done. Additionally, we do some trail etiquette education. Over the pandemic, we saw trail usage doubling and tripling on some of our local trails. And we had some new trail users and just some added pressures out there on the trails. So we want to do what we could to encourage people to be good neighbors, responsible trail users. And we know that people don't really read signs very well or at all. So we want to think of a fun way to kind of get that message out about how to be a good trail user. So we came up with this whole series of comics that we put out on our social media and got posted on the trails, just with messages like this one here, where you see some guidance on how a mountain biker can interact with other trail users. So they're really popular, good way to engage people, make it a little more fun. We've definitely seen some positive outcomes related to that. So Chitoni Coast Dairies, yeah, that's the big exciting project that we're working on. It's really exciting to see that coming along after decades really of planning around that. So for those of you who aren't familiar, federally owned BLM property, Bureau of Land Management property, became a monument in 2017, in no small part due to the hard work of Semper Virens Funds. So we thank y'all for that hard work there. We really got involved with the project when the Bureau of Land Management took possession of the property in 2014, because at that time we were working next door at San Vicente on trail design there, and the two properties were adjacent, and there was an intention to have a connection between the two. So we began talking with the BLM at that point about what that might look like, to get our heads wrapped around that. And then from there, the monument campaign happened, and then the planning process started, where the BLM, did their due diligence, their public planning, updated their documents, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And at that point, we had been advocates for the property and also talking about how we could help the BLM implement the plans out there. And, the Bureau of Land Management manages huge swaths of land, but they're a small and scrappy organization. They have, relatively little funding and staffing compared to some of the other land management agencies. So they really depend on partnerships to get things done. So we kind of raised our hand to say, hey, we can help you guys get these trails, built, maintained, funded. So we developed a cooperative agreement with the Bureau of Land Management, where we've taken responsibility for the design, construction, funding, and maintenance of these trails. So we are Santa Cruz Mountain Trail Stewardship is taking the lead on this $2.7 million project, which we're funding through a little bit of federal grant money, but mostly through state grants, corporate sponsorships, and individual giving. So a large part of this project will be funded by the public through donations. So I could just talk about our role in the project. Yeah, so let's talk about trail design. We'll use Coast Areas as an example there. It's it's a relatively involved process. So the trail buildings, we always say, is the easy part. It's the planning and the design that takes a lot of time, thought, and there's a lot more complexity to it. So it all starts with land use planning. Every park, preserve has some type of document that's outlining how that place can be used or shouldn't be used. So here you see Big Basins, the San Vicente, and also Coast Dairies. The BLM updated their management plan. They finalized that in 2021, so last year. That really dictated all the uses on the property and management goals, and also the trail plan. So we were involved with that and helping them think through that looks like. And really, you know, trail design is a function of these kind of three main components here, right? So looking for those opportunities where the overlap between trail user desires, landscape traits, and land manager goals, where those things intersect. You know, so we've got in the planning process, we heard all kinds of crazy desires that people wanted to, of things people want to do on the property, you know, motorized use, paragliding, all kinds of stuff out there. And that wasn't necessarily compatible with the land manager goals, the monumental decree, and some of the landscape traits. So not everything that people wanted was possible out there. So, you know, we took all these different inputs and figured out, hey, what we can do out there. And that's what ultimately went into the trail plan. And some of those design goals that were established through that planning process for Coast Dairies were that we wanted to have a stacked loop trail network. And what that means is that we've got multiple smaller loops. People can choose to go on as long an adventure as they want to. Like, go a short loop from the parking lot and back, or add on additional loops. And the further away from the parking lot you get, the more kind of challenging and rugged your experience is going to be. So that was one of the goals. Additionally, we wanted to minimize potential for user conflict. We have, again, like similar to San Vicente, a unique opportunity here to design from the ground up and really think about how these trails are going to work for the different trail users. So what came out of that plan is we're going to do the same as San Vicente and have those separate bike hike trails and hike horse trails, and have good sight lines, use all kinds of the other best practices for minimizing user conflict. And avoid sensitive cultural areas. The Chitoni people have a long history on this property. There's lots of activity out there. Unfortunately, the Amamutsan Land Trust was able to do extensive surveying on the property to catalog a lot of the sites. So we don't get the details on what they found or where exactly it is, but we get the details on, hey, these are the areas that we need to avoid. Similarly, we want to avoid sensitive habitat. There's a number of salmon-bearing streams on the property, so we don't want to avoid any impacts there. We've got coastal prairie, which is a unique habitat, and a little bit of rare species out there too. Additionally, leaving some corridors without any public access to preserve wildlife habitat was an additional goal. So you'll see when you look at the maps that there's large parts of that property that don't have any trails on them. And we want to provide a variety of experiences for various trail user types with different skill and fitness levels. So, you know, we want to be able to serve equestrian trail users, mountain bikers, disabled folks, runners, hikers, bird watchers, and people who, you know, may have different abilities within those different pursuits. Yeah, and I mentioned ADA wheelchair access was a huge part of the design goals, as well as adaptive mountain bike access, both of which are things we don't have a ton of here locally. So we're excited to be able to provide that. Also, to highlight the diverse range of ecotones, Coast Dairies is a phenomenal property in that you've got coastal prairie, you've got redwood studded canyons, you've got oak woodlands, you've got chaparrals, you kind of have it all out there. So we wanted to really highlight all that diversity. And then last but not least, we want to minimize impact to the neighbors. You know, Coast Dairies is situated between Davenport and Bonnie Doon, which are very, you know, very proud and protective of their rural environments. So we wanted to be as respectful of that as we can and kind of minimize that impact as much as possible. So through all that, you know, it's a lot of different things to be thinking about, and then putting all that against, hey, what's possible in the landscape. So we start off with those thoughts in mind and all that information mapped out as best as possible. So where those archaeological sites are, where we can have parking areas, where the sensitive habitat is, and, you know, overlay all of that on some really detailed topographic maps. And then we identify, hey, these are the areas where we can have these different types of trails, and just take some broad brushstrokes, come up with conceptual design. You know, we're not putting we're not putting too much time thinking exactly where a trail is going to go, but just generally, this is where a trail should go. And we're going back and forth with the land manager and other stakeholders to refine this and figure out what's going to work, what's not going to work. So once that's complete, we spend more time on the ground. So, you know, that conceptual design may take us to some places that you wouldn't normally go. So here's, you know, our volunteers who are helping with the trail scouting, crawling through 20 foot of poison oak. So we have to see everywhere that we think a trail is going to go to make sure that there's no unidentified, sensitive species or other constraints, and B, that it's actually possible to put a trail there. So yeah, it does require some extreme bushwhacking. And just for reference, this is what that section of trail looks like under construction. So pretty big difference. Yeah, so we're scouting all those different conceptual designs, whether it's in the prairie and the poison oak. We're checking grades to make sure that we can have trails that won't be too steep in there. Going through the burn zone as well. So really getting to know the property. And we're going back and forth to the map the whole time. So here's a GIS screenshot showing all the different scouting trips that we're taking to come up with the final alignments out there. So it really is an iterative process to find that best trail alignment that's going to meet all those design goals to reduce impacts, to provide a great user experience, public safety, all those things. So it's a back and forth between the field and the computer. At the end of the day, we come up with the trail plan. This is what went into the Bureau of Land Management's final management plan. So here we see Tony Coast areas, the 4 individual zones, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we see that there's trails on zone 1 and zone 3, but zones 2 and 4 are left open for habitat preservation and some restoration work. So on the north side of the property, in RMZ1, is where we've got access focused on hiking and mountain bike use, as well as a connection to San Vicente Redwoods, which I'll show you on an additional map here. In the southern part of the property is more focused on hiking and equestrian use, as well as ADA wheelchair access. This blue loop here is going to be a surfaced ADA wheelchair accessible trail. It's up on the first marine terrace. The views are just mind-boggling. You can see all the way to Big Sur. So we're really excited about that. We don't have anything quite like that here on the coast. And through this process, we've figured out where the trails are going to go, but also really thought about the purpose of those trails, who they're going to serve, and how they need to be built. So here we have our trail matrix for Tony Coast areas. We're looking at each section of trail and really defining all these different things. So we're looking at the difficulty level, what type of use it's going to have, the width of the trail, its average grade, its maximum allowable grade, the habitat that's going to be in, the character of the trail, in a narrative for it. So to give you an example of what that means, we can look at 2 different trails. So we talked about that stacked loop concept earlier on. So the Agua Puerca loop here is that first loop from the parking lot. So it's a little bit easier. And that trail is going to be 4 feet wide, have an average grade of 4%, which is the steepness, a maximum grade of 7%. And it's going to be the coastal grassland. It's going to be smooth, machine built, surfaced with base rock in places, with a firm and stable tread. So this is the closest loop to the parking lot, generally follows the edge of the marine terrace with views into canyons and towards the ocean. The goal is to meet federal accessibility guidelines for grading the surface. Trail will be open to cattle grazing seasonally. So we got that trail as opposed to the Molino Creek Loop West, which is going to be 2 feet wide, so half the width of that other trail. Average grade 6%, maximum sustained grade 18%. It's going to have some steep sections just due to the challenging terrain there. Maximum grade of 30%. It's going to be hand-built, narrow, tight turns, some sections of exposure, moderate tread texture. It'll have some unavoidable obstacles 8 inches tall or less. The narrative is that it's a narrow trail that climbs out of Molino Canyon in redwood forest on steep slope, mostly hand-built, significant exposure, and steeper average trail grades in some sections. So we've really thought about what these trails are going to be like, who's going to use them, making sure we're thinking about, those maximum obstacle heights so that we're not putting barriers in for access where there shouldn't be. So at the end, so here's a large scale view of a section of trail. This is probably a 1/4 mile of trail. So we figured out exactly where that trail is going to go. It's GPSed out. We've identified where different features are going to be, whether it's a retaining wall, an armored swale crossing, a switchback, how it's going to be built, whether it's machine built or hand built. So we've really got this all mapped out. So when our trail builders get out there, they know exactly what they're doing, and we're sure that all those other constraints and considerations have already been addressed and we're ready to go here with the final construction. So here's the final map of Chitoni Coast Areas, similar to what we saw earlier. And you can see the connection to San Vicente here a little bit better in the top, in the northern part of the property. So this is where San Vicente connects in Coast Areas. So trail construction. So we've done all our design work. It's all mapped out, all approved. It's been reviewed numerous times by all the different ologists, the land manager, to make sure that we're, dotting our I's and crossing our T's. So now we're ready to build trails. Here's a picture of a happy volunteer out at Coast Areas. So I'm just going to talk through like our process at a pretty high level of how we approach trail construction. And the first thing we're going to do is clear the corridor. So we saw those poor volunteers traipsing through the poison oak earlier. So we have to come in and actually clear that out. Luckily, about half of our crew doesn't get poison oak, so they get the job of clearing that out. So we're going to clear out as much of that brush and vegetation as we can. Then we're going to do our final flagging. So we've already done our trail design. That's really at about a 20-foot level corridor. So now we're going to establish exactly where that trail goes, and we put these pin flags in, so then when our volunteers or trail crew come in, they know exactly where that trail is going to be. And at that point, we want to remove organics. We have this rule in trail building that our organics do not mix with our mineral soil, because if we leave that duff or plant matter in, it's going to break down, and we won't have a stable trail surface, which is going to lead to erosion and potholes and just not a very enjoyable experience and kind of a maintenance nightmare. So we really rake back all the organics. We save those for after construction, which we'll talk about later. We also, we preserve any plants that we can replant later and transplant at the end of after we've built the trail. So at that point, we need to actually dig the trail. So sometimes we use machines. This is out at Coast Areas, and some of those loops closer to the parking lot, we're using machine construction because it's efficient. You can get that smoother trail character. So we're using machines out there, and in some of the other areas at Coast Areas, so that second trail we talked about, Molino Creek West part of the loop, we're hand building it. Some steeper terrain where to do machine construction, we have to make massive cuts. So this allows us to minimize our impact on the landscape by building by hand, moving much less dirt. So we're hand constructing here. And sometimes hand construction involves going through rocky areas where we're jackhammering or picking out the tread surface. And sometimes it involves building rock walls to retain dirt on steeper hillsides. Coast Areas is kind of interesting in this regard because the native rock there is mudstone, which has a high clay content and shrinks and swells. So as it gets wet, it swells up. As it dries out, it shrinks and it fractures through that process. So it's not very good for building structures. So in this case, at Coast Areas, we're actually importing rock to build these structures. This is granite that we've had to wheelbarrow down this trail to build this retaining wall to hold the trail up. So very labor intensive, expensive, but it's what it takes to put trails in some of these more remote areas. After the excavation's done, any structures are built, we're doing our finish grading. So we're coming in, smoothing out that trail surface, getting rid of any roots that may remain in the trail so we don't have that organic matter there. We've pretty much got our trail exactly how we want it. All our drainage is put in so that we're not going to have any erosion issues. And then we come in and compact it. We want to have a nice compact trail surface so that the trails resist erosion. They're resilient for use. They're not, breaking up and washing away or blowing away. So the compaction really helps with that. And at that point, we're ready to renaturalize. So all that duff and organic matter that we saved at the beginning of the process, we set that aside, And we reintroduce that and cover up any bare dirt out there for a couple of reasons. One, it looks really nice. Two, it's erosion prevention, so we don't have any bare dirt exposed to the wind or to rain. And three, because it keeps people on the trail. We've got a really well-defined trail at this point, so we're not worried about people walking off the edges of the trail or cutting trail, because it's, you know, it doesn't look inviting at that point. We're also replanting anything we're able to save at that point. And we've got a finished trail. So here's some finished trail at Coast Dairies. This is that first loop pretty close to the parking lot. You can see it's pretty wide, not too steep. You can actually see some rock features up in the above the machines there in the corner for drainage. So that's that first loop. And here's the second loop. We talked about the Molino Creek West. Very different character. You see it's in the woods, narrow. Yeah, different experience. And with the goal of it having a great user experience out there. So here's one of our trail crew enjoying the sunset out there. And we're really looking forward to getting these trails opened so that everyone's able to come enjoy that experience as well. I'm going to stop my presentation there. And if people have questions, you can email me directly, but I look forward to digging in more with Sarah and with any of your all's questions.
Thank you, Matt. This was great. And I want to thank you and your organization. I feel like you all have really upped the caliber of trails in our region, and it's been dramatic, the difference. So thank you.
Thank you.
I want to start with kind of a philosophical question. The Semper Virens, for its whole 120+ year history, has had a dual mandate of preservation, conservation, and access and enjoyment. And it's always a tension, right, between protecting these places, particularly more sensitive landscapes, and letting people experience them and enjoy them. And in our region, we have the esteemed Puma researcher, Chris Wilmers, who I think you referenced, who, gosh, has really opened my eyes to just how human presence, human voice across distance can be disturbing to even a creature as big and you'd think self-confident as a mountain lion. And so it's something that we wrestle with at Semper Virens, right? We have this amazing property that we own, San Vicente Redwoods, and the debate is, and we've spent 11 years doing ecological restoration, and it's about to open to the public, which we are both delighted about and a little bit nervous about because of the potential of what human presence means in a place like that. And the same is true of Coast Dairies, as you well know. So I'm just curious, I mean, obviously the simple answer is it's a balancing act, but I'm wondering how you think about it at kind of a philosophical level, you know, this tension between protecting a place and helping it be accessible for the public to experience. So just any thoughts about that tension?
Yeah, it's a balancing act. Yeah, no, it is a tension, and we really look to those planning documents as our guide, right? We're not a property owner. We're here to help people meet their goals in providing good public access. So we're really deferential to the experts on those issues, right? Whether it's the clients or Chris Wilmers, as who had he had just a large input on the design at San Vicente, where we were buffering mountain lion denning habitats by a mile, which is it's just a huge area that we're not putting any humans into. So it depends on the intent of the property, right? Like some properties and designations are more focused on that preservation, where some are going to be more intensely used too. So we really look at that intent from the start on what the intention is, and that informs our approach to design and whatnot. And there's always, we're not making these decisions generally about impacts to habitat. We're there at after all the ologists and the land manager have really identified what those constraints are.
And the hand-wringing EDs at land trusts who want to make sure they do the right thing in terms of striking that balance. And I really appreciate that you all have listened so carefully, and I think you walked through the kinds of things that you consider, which is good for our audience to understand how carefully these things are designed. I loved your Venn diagram in which you showed the different kind of considerations within which you find that core where all these things overlap and you can actually build the trail. And I'm curious, in your tenure doing this work, how have you seen those things evolve? What's changed, either in terms of our understanding of ecological impacts or what people's user experiences and desired experiences are? Have you seen, I'm assuming you've seen that evolve over time, either during your tenure or when you look at trails that were, say, put in, I don't know, 50 years ago, what might have been considered then that today we would never do?
Yeah, sure. I think, the two things that jump out at me are the amount of use on trails, which we've seen, even before the pandemic, we saw an increase there. So thinking about, A, the impacts on wildlife, but B, like how do we build trails that'll be resilient against that. And then I think the big thing is the user experience. Historically, trails didn't really take that into account that much. A lot of our trails were inherited as from farm roads or logging roads, or just user created by someone.
Or animal trails, right?
Or animal trails, right? So it's, wasn't a lot of intent put into, or intention put into, hey, whatever, preserving the environment or having a great user experience. How do we get from point A to point B most efficiently, right? We're humans, that's where we always regress to without these other considerations. So really the trend in trail construction has been thinking about that user experience on top of all these other inputs as well. So, 20 years ago, you probably wouldn't have seen that trail matrix looking at, what people have this experience for this type of user. It would have been really just focused on how do we build a sustainable trail from point A to point B. So that's really where we pride ourselves, is bringing the other element is, hey, we got to do those things, protect the environment, build sustainable trails, but how do we provide the best possible user experience on top of all that? So I think that's the trend we're seeing now, which just leads to much better trails, and also alleviates a lot of problems that we've seen with those historical trails. Yeah.
One of the things that I know we've gotten more thoughtful about at Semper Virens, and I think it's true among many of the conservation organizations with whom we partner, is sort of this awareness that not everybody gets access to the outdoors or feels safe in the outdoors or feels comfortable. And you alluded to the fact that you have within your trail design, levels of difficulty. I'm sure the Americans with Disabilities Act has impacted considerably how you think about trail design and what considerations come into play. But could you talk a little bit about how you all are thinking about making sure these trails are as accessible in a kind of equitable way to as many people as possible?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it really does come down to defining how the trail needs to be to meet those goals, right? So we know there's great guidelines for ADA access and for wheelchairs and different levels of accessibility trails. So we've got a great place to start, right? So we can build trails that meet that meet those constraints just by the planning, right? So, okay, that trail closest to the parking lot, we're going to make sure that we got low grades, wide trail, that anyone who shows up at the property is going to be able to get out there and enjoy it. And then the further out you get, that's not necessarily the case. And it's partly dictated by, providing a diverse range of experiences, but partly by the landscape too. Tony Coast Areas is pretty much either pancake flat or straight up and down. So you got these beautiful marine terraces.
Yeah.
You have those those experiences that anyone will be able to enjoy. Then you've got these steep canyons where the trail may only be able to go in one place. And it may need to be a narrow trail with steep grades and whatnot. So there's this whole juggling act, right, of the Venn diagram and the trail user desires and the landscape.
One of the things that we've wrestled with a bit at Semper Virens is the issue of e-bikes. But it could be, that's just in our region has been one of the latest issues, but, looking elsewhere, west-wide in the United States, it's not just e-bikes, it's Jeeps that can be winched up a waterfall in a stream, or, all kinds of motorized access that allow people to get farther into wild places, which is both a blessing and a curse. And we've struggled with that, how to balance the desire to have people who may have physical limitations, or maybe they're just out of shape, whatever, get in to see natural beauty and not bring so many people into those remote places that you scare off the mountain lions and everything else that makes those places special. What are your thoughts about e-bikes and some of those other kinds of, not tools isn't the right term, but things that are allowing people to get into nature where they may not have otherwise been able to get there?
Yeah, certainly a challenging time with those, in that respect, with all these new technologies coming out, e-bikes and one wheels and all manner of new contraptions. Yeah, I mean, I think really it needs to come back to the science and our understanding of the impacts of these things. So I think it's easy to get the substance and the stylistic things confused. Like, okay, this is a motor vehicle, it's automatically bad. I think it's about like, hey, let's actually let's look at the literature, see what the issues really are, and then go from there. Because I think around e-bikes there isn't really great literature that says there's
it's too new almost, right? I feel like we don't really know yet.
Well, it's too new, but there is some literature out there, and it doesn't really support some of the things we've heard about, like, hey, it gets people too far out, which maybe shouldn't be there, or it brings too many people. And I think, kind of where I go to is the impact to wildlife really is about human presence or not necessarily about what type. I mean, if you're on a dirt bike making a ton of noise, you're going to have more, but like these lower impact things, it's really about if there's humans there or not. So I think that's the issue. We should make that the issue and not get confused by different use, because there's going to be so many new uses coming out, who knows what's coming next. So if we're worried about the number of people, maybe that's what we need to think about more. A lot of areas have gone to a permit system. We'll be seeing that at Big Basin most likely. So I think it's sometimes we get latched onto these other things, or we're kicking the big hairy monster challenges down the road. So e-bikes, are becoming hugely popular. Public's accepted them. So I think, we're seeing them allowed more and more at different places. So I think really focusing on, hey, how do we design our trails around minimizing the impacts rather than like the more harder enforcement techniques is what we see more effective.
Yeah. Well, and that's when I said at the outset, I credit you all. I feel like you have done that. Been really thoughtful about thinking about how you manage for the likely impacts on the trails themselves. Switching gears, so to speak, e-bike. We know nature is dynamic, right? These are ever evolving landscapes. And in our region, you alluded to this, but in our region, and certainly on San Vicente, that entire property pretty much burned in the CCU wildfire 2 years ago, and it'll burn again. Part of the Chitoni Coast Areas Monument burned. Now we're facing on both properties drought. And was talking with some of the folks involved with the trail building at San Vicente now, and they were saying how it's actually quite ashy because of the fire and because it's been so dry. And I'm just curious, what did you all have to rethink as a result of the fire on San Vicente, because it happened before you started your trail building? And, how are you thinking about what happens when we're facing drought or other things that are going to impact those trails that you either put in or are about to put in a place?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the CCU Fire was definitely a big curveball in terms of the public access at San Vicente. So I mean, how we approached that was really just getting out there, understand, the change in the landscape, and hear from you guys from Post and Semper Vire and say, hey, this is what we're seeing out there.
Yeah, we were nervous ninnies about it.
Yeah, well, rightfully so. So just understanding what's going on out there. Look at the fire severity maps to see what burned, what got nuked versus what didn't. So, I think we largely found that our existing alignments are going to work. There's a couple of trails that in that first phase that were decided not to be constructed because they went through some of that really severely burned area, and there was concerns about landslides and erosion. So that got paused till later on. So yeah, and then, you know, from a trail design perspective, right? So when we're out there designing trails, we're looking at, you know, the flora, not the, yeah, the flora, sorry, flora, fauna, flora. And that's part of our design, you know, our thinking about design. So we may have a trail that uses a tree as an anchor, so we can go above that. And we're using this brush for screening a switchback. So without all of that, you know, things do have to get tweaked a little bit, but, you know, by and large, we use relatively the same alignments as we designed before. And then in terms of the ongoing challenges, you know, these trails are built to be sustainable, and minimal grades aren't too high and whatnot. So we're confident that they should be pretty resilient, you know, given fire and drought and whatnot. You know, and here in Santa Cruz County, like we've got, you know, whether we're in a drought or not, we've got, you know, 7 months a year with no rain. So we're already
it's normal.
Yeah, right. So that's part of our planning. Yeah.
Well, all right. I could ask you a lot of questions, but I'm going to open the floor up to my colleagues who I think have been looking through questions they may have received, and give them a chance to ask some questions from the audience. But thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving us a look behind the scenes on how trails come to be. We've got lots of questions. One question had to do actually more with your interaction with the organizations and land managers who manage the public access component. How much do you stay involved? Do you work beyond the trail building to help with things like figuring out parking, or helping monitor use on trails, and you know, making any adjustments down in the future?
Yeah, great question. So, you know, we're a local grassroots community-based organization. So we're staying as involved as we can be throughout the process. So we're not just walking away after the trail has been built. So we're participating in those conversations about parking lots and whatnot to, you know, degree which we're, you know, knowledgeable to speak to those things. And then definitely on the management side. So we build trails as if we're going to be maintaining them, and we often are long term. So we think about that and make sure that we're building things as resilient as possible to minimize that burden which we expect to face in the future. So there's that. And then in terms of monitoring, yeah, we've got a trail counter program where we've actually designed our own trail counter. And so we're monitoring use and developing a model which we can use some user generated data to really understand those use patterns out there. So we've seen the patterns through the pandemic and through the fires and whatnot. So yeah, we're providing that data to our agency partners and other people working on these access issues.
That's terrific. Thank you for sharing that. That's really helpful, I think, for people to understand the different ways in which you're involved beyond just the making of the trails as well. One question about Chitoni Coast Aires and its future, not to speculate on when it's going to open, because I know that that's uncertain at the moment, but we expect it will. But it sounds like there are plans to link up San Vicente into Chitoni Coast Aires and down to State Park Bluff Tops. Are you familiar with that? And what might that look like in terms of how long that might take to make all those connections happen?
Yeah, so, you know, we're at San Vicente, we've built the first of 3 phases. We actually started at the top off Empire Grade. So that's what's going in now. And then, you know, through the public access plan that Semper Virens and Post and State Roads League and the Land Trust to come up with, there's a monitoring period where we're going to look at, evaluate success before we go on to phase 2 and 3, which would then connect to the coast areas. So I think there's a, you know, a couple of year interim there, and it'll depend on how things go. It's kind of like that adaptive management strategy, which is, you know, giving these organizations the ability to react to what they're seeing out there. So then as far as coast areas, the connection, the trails will hopefully reach full build out in that northern zone of trails next year. So that would allow for that connection. Yeah, and then one of the rail trails, another element of that, which will connect to coast areas as well and provide that connection back to Davenport and back to Santa Cruz as well. I don't know, Sarah, if you have anything to add about that.
I mean, I think we're hopeful that we will get to that full build out. I have no idea what kind of timeline we're looking at. I think a lot of it depends on what we see in terms of user rates and our experience on the landscape with it. But what I love is that there's this larger vision to really integrate San Vicente with Chitoni Costeres, with Wilder Ranch, and with the rail trail, so that you really could each different property owners, but working together so that at the end, hopefully we have a real world-class experience that we can offer to outdoor enthusiasts to see pretty diverse set of landscapes. But I don't want to speculate on timing. Everything seems to take longer than you would think or hope.
That all sounds right. But thank you for sort of painting that picture for what's possible. One of our guests noted that at Chitoni Costeres, it looks like the trails are all multi-use. And is that correct? And do you know offhand what kinds of steps will be taken to encourage, safe and thoughtful sharing of trails?
Yeah, so at Costeres, the trails are split mostly between two designations, where there will be open to hikers and mountain bikers, or hikers and equestrians. So it's actually split by the two different networks on the property. So that southern trail network that you saw on the map, that will be open to equestrians and hikers, as well as that's where the ADA wheelchair access will be. And the northern part will be open to hikers and mountain bikers. And the trails are really built with this in mind, so to minimize social or any user conflict out there. And we're exploring things like having suggested directional loops for mountain bikers, so that we can send people one way and really set expectations for other trail users where they'll have those encounters. So definitely something we're thinking about a lot. We'll be heavy on the education on trail etiquette as well out there.
That's great. Thank you so much for clarifying that. What are you seeing in terms of unauthorized trails being established throughout the region? And is there an enforcement agency that deals with that? How does that work? Yeah,
so it is a major challenge here in Santa Cruz County, unofficial trail use. So we've actually done a survey of our mileage of trail here in the county. We've got about 220 miles of official single track trail. 180 of those are open to horses. About less than 50 are open to mountain bikers. So a little bit of a disparity there for, mountain biking has been this growing sport. So we have seen the demand for those trails really increase over the last decade, and not a whole lot of new trail coming online for that use. So unofficial trail creation has become widespread on lands that have largely been unmanaged or don't have much of a presence on them. So we've seen that somewhere. We haven't really seen it in places where there's active management, where there's existing trails. It's not so much a concern. So it's something we're actively working on with some of those agencies that are dealing with that issue. So state parks, UCSC, the city of Santa Cruz. We've got a working group together where we're looking at, hey, how do we, provide the use people seek, but mitigate some of these existing challenges and this growing issue. So. It's not a simple one. It's not just about enforcement or creating new trails. It's a whole complex mix of different management techniques. And we're early on in that process too. I'm hopeful that we'll be rolling out some pilot projects here in the next couple of years to start to address some of that.
I think managing the users is really tough, and the user to user conflicts are really tough, and we just try to do the best we can. So I really appreciate that you all are sort of interfacing with some of these user groups directly around user education, and to help with both sort of etiquette and code of ethics, sort of, because I think that's where it's going to start. So it will be interesting to see how it plays out on these landscapes. But I want to thank you, Matt. These are really complex issues. You've been a great partner to us on San Vicente. We know that Tony Coast-Dairies is in good hands because of your all's involvement in terms of the trail network, and really appreciate you coming and joining our audience today and sharing your wisdom. I hope our audience came away understanding that trail building is so much more than just raking the forest, as someone once said. That it's quite complex, and it's a bit art and it's a bit science, and it takes a lot of thought and a lot of listening, and appreciate to you, Matt, that your team does that very well. Thank you to our audience for joining us, and thank you again to Scharf Investments for underwriting this webinar series. I hope that you will join us next week, or next month, I should say. We are going to be talking actually about similar landscapes, San Vicente and Tony Coast-Dairies, and our guests will be Alec Apodaca and Alexi Sigoni, who are going to talk to us a bit about some of the cultural research, archaeological research they've been doing on our property. So looking forward to it, and thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you, guys.